Welcome to a session in our Understanding Your Historic Building series. We're really pleased to have Scott Hanson with us here today to talk about historic houses for contemporary lives. So, big thank you to our sponsors. Today's session is being made possible with the generous support of Northland, Norway Savings Bank, Bateman Partners, Consigli, Hardy Pond Construction, the Heritage Company, Taggart Construction, Thornton Tomasetti Becker, and the North River Company. We really thank them for helping make this possible and to bring this information to you. So let's talk a little bit about Scott. Scott Hanson is an architectural historian and director of preservation consulting services for Sutherland Conservation and Consulting in Hallowell, Maine. Over the past 4 decades, he has been a designer, carpenter, painter, paper hanger, municipal preservation planner, preservation consultant, historic house owner, and vice chair of a historic district commission. These many roles have provided him with a broad range of experience in the field of home renovation and restoration. His writing on the subject has appeared in Down East and Maine Homes by Down East magazines and the Sunday Boston Globe newspaper. His most recent book, Restoring Your Historic House, The Comprehensive Guide for Homeowners, was released in December of 2019 and immediately became a hit. It sold out on Amazon and other retailers online the day it was released. And speaking with Scott, just before we got started, he's up to almost 50,000 copies. It's pretty amazing considering the COVID climate that we're in. So we're really excited for him. We're delighted that Scott could join us here today to talk about how to approach restoring a historic house in a way that identifies and preserves its most important character defining features while making it livable for the 21st century life. Scott, take it away.
Thank you, Allie. One clarification, we were talking about the fact that I'm up to 50,000 social media followers, not 50,000 books sold. I'll be happy when we get to 50,000 books sold. So, historic homes or houses for contemporary lives. The starting point, of course, is finding the right historic house to suit your contemporary life. There's a great range of houses that might be considered historic. Few people would question that Thomas Jefferson's Monticello is a historic house. On the slide, the house at the bottom left, most people would recognize, I think, as a historic house. It likely could be a contributing building in a local or National Register historic district. The house at the upper right might be a little more hard for some people to identify as historic. They might just see it as an old house. It's the house my great-great-grandparents owned, so to me it's a historic house. And then we get into post-war housing, like the wonderful little house on the lower right, which are increasingly being recognized as historic houses. Many of them are now over 50 years old, and to a younger generation particularly, they are clearly historic houses. So the question is, what type suits your life? And depending on the style of of a historic house, when it was built, even to an extent where it was built, there can be a wide range of starting points for what is a historic house and how might it suit a particular family or person's life in the 21st century. For instance, earlier houses tend to have rooms that are very closed boxes with doors between them, and you can shut off every part of the house from every other part of the house because that was important for conserving heat when fireplaces were the only form of heating. And then later in the 19th century, floor plans start to open up. You see double parlors with wide openings that might have pocket doors between them. And then you get to the end of the 19th century, and starting particularly with the shingle style, you see floor plans open right up so that the living room, entry hall, dining area, all sort of flow together in this big open space, which feels a lot more contemporary. And then they'll still, at that point, service areas were still very much contained and out of sight. And then this opening continues. So colonial revival is taking plan elements from shingle style and using colonial character and detail, but more open floor plans. And then you get to the post-war period and floor plans become recognizably modern and very open. So depending on what suits your life, a house of a different period might suit the way you live better. And so understanding what different house styles are and how plans evolved through time can help you determine what type of house suits your 21st century life. So let's look at a couple of houses and the 21st century lives that are lived in them. And I'm intentionally showing a wide range here. And these are photos from the book. Mostly the new photos are by David Clough, who did the feature house photography for the book. And Dow Farm is pretty much at one extreme of what is a 21st century life. In this house, 21st century life looks a whole lot like 19th century life. It's not a museum. It functions as a daily home today, but it certainly feels a bit like a museum. And that suits the lifestyle of the residents. And this Cyrus Carpenter brickset cook range made in 1885 is used on a daily basis for cooking and heating, and also supplies the hot water for the house. So this is, one way of living in the 21st century that requires very little change to an earlier house. Most of us, of course, don't live like this. We want a few more creature comforts, including central heating, which this house still does not have. The Hench House is a wonderful 1887 Victorian house that's actually on the cover of the book. And this is a house that is reaching the point where the floor plan starts to open up. There are big double wide door openings between the spaces. You can see a pocket door on the left. And this one is still treated very much as a period setting. And the owners, in order to afford the extensive restoration for this house that was under a demolition order, operated it as a bed and breakfast for a decade. So part of their marketing for having a successful bed and breakfast was evoking this Victorian feeling, like this wonderful Bradbury and Bradbury reproduction, papered ceiling. So this is a case where the house is still feeling very much of a period, although there are pieces from many periods mixed in to the overall Victorian theme that is going on with the house. And there's a historic photo and a current photo of it. And in the attic, there were spaces that were, underutilized historically that are now repurposed as a modern music room. There was a sewing studio. They're usable spaces for the interests of the owners that didn't require any changes to the historically significant spaces down below. Moving to Chicago, we have a wonderful Chicago bungalow from 1924, the Polich House. And this house, again, the floor plan is opening up. It's 20th century. And so the spaces start to flow together. And these owners have a fairly contemporary decorating aesthetic that's very spare. There's not a lot of furniture in this house, and it really allows the features of the house to shine, particularly the 40-some art glass windows that they restored. And it's very much intact. It's very much of the period, but in the way they've furnished it, it feels contemporary and it suits the way they live. And I think that's really the key, is how do you get the house to suit the way you live? And to find the house you can do that in without destroying it to make it suit the way you live. A few more photos from Chicago. And here the kitchen has a very contemporary feel, and we'll talk more about kitchens and baths in just a minute. But in this kitchen, the plaster is original, the windows are original, the white subway tile wainscoting is original, the wood floor is original. What's new is the cabinetry, countertops, and appliances. These are folks who cook quite a lot. So function was very important to them, and natural daylight was very important to them. So instead of taking out windows to put in cabinets, they just did without any wall cabinets and put in more base cabinets. So the kitchen, although contemporary, feels related to the rest of the house, and no historic material was lost in creating a very functional modern kitchen. And the pantry that you see in the distance in the lower lower left photo is also completely intact. Wonderful tile detail from the bathroom in this house. And all the plumbing fixtures were retained, although all the plumbing behind the wall was replaced. Going to the modern end of the spectrum, we have the Weston House from 1957, which is this really wonderful, intact, really, ranch house that is a contemporary house, making it a bit easier to live a contemporary life in it. It was built with central heating and passive solar window arrangement with sunscreens and many features you could put in or would not be surprised to see in a house built today, but also these wonderful built-ins that have that 1950s atomic era character to them, which you wouldn't really find in a house today. It really is a classic of its time. It's the period where the house got its own, the car got its own front door to the house, and the front door for people became rather secondary. Just classic features. Note the doorknob in the center of the front door, the slate flagstone interior flooring. You know, these are elements you would very much expect from this period, including the rec room in the basement with the built-in bar. And there's the original owner behind her bar back in the 1950s. And this house has wonderful, intact, original wallpapers in some of the spaces, including the bathrooms with this metallic Pegasus paper. So living a modern life in this house would be easy for almost anyone. It really wouldn't take much adaptation of the house or the person. But when you are, and here's the kitchen, which was lightly updated by the last owners. The original appliances, after more than a half a century, needed to be replaced. And so new appliances were found that evoked the feeling of the originals, and the cabinets were gently adapted to suit them. And one more view of that. And then what about a space that never was finished historically, like an attic or a barn interior or a shed? if you need more space, there's an opportunity to do something truly contemporary. This example is in Portland, and it's an apartment added in an unfinished attic that is entirely contemporary, but has elements that help to tie it into the 19th century house that it is in. And those elements are the new hardwood flooring, which is laid on the diagonal to give it a more contemporary feeling, the salvaged stained glass window, the wonderful hand-forged cable ties that are used to stabilize the roof that the owner fabricated himself. So it's a contemporary space that has some little hints that tie it to the past. And as an Airbnb unit, it paid for rehabbing the rest of the house. It's been very, very popular as an Airbnb unit. So if you want to do something that's completely contemporary in character and style, don't destroy an intact historic space. Find a building that has spaces that are open for a new use and new character without destroying something that is historic. So making an old house suitable for contemporary life really starts with finding the right house and then planning the changes that are needed to suit your life. And, you know, if you are buying a 1950s house, you might not need to make many changes. If you're comfortable living in a manner that's very much like a 19th century life, a 19th century house might need little change. But if you're like most of us and you're buying an earlier house, but you need to function in a fairly contemporary life, there will be changes needed. And so the key to doing that in a way that preserves the character of the house is to, first of all, identify what it is, to really understand the house in question. And we're going to look at this house, which is Witten House in Topsham, my house, the one I'm sitting in as I'm speaking, and sort of use it as a case study for how you can think through and work through the design process to make the house function and preserve its character. In this case, understanding the house took a lot of investigation to realize eventually that it started out as a cape with a kitchenelle, much like the red house at the top. And in the middle of the 19th century was expanded from the Federal Cape to a Greek Revival two-story house with a finished attic. And one of the great clues to that was in the door surround that you see here, which started out on the left as a very typical Federal style entry door, 6-panel, flat pilasters, transom above the door, jammed right up against the eaves of the roof. When the house was expanded, it needed a more prominent door to stay in scale with the house and also to update its style 25 years later to the Greek Revival. So the elements you see at the center were added around the Federal style door to create the door that is there today, which in its form and its materials has the evidence of the change. You would not have found this door made this way in 1850, unless it started with an 1820s door. So there are these clues you can find if you understand what you're looking at and study the architectural styles, the building techniques, and look for the clues. Other clues that Witten House had been expanded were the fact that the first story clapboards had an original coat of red paint and they were scarfed at their joints, while the second story had no red paint and butt jointed clapboards. On the interior, there are doors that clearly had thumb latches that were replaced with knobs. And in the historic photos, the shutters that are now long gone show different shutters on the two stories, indicating that they were installed at different times. And the interior trim similarly shows things that are clearly federal style of the 1820s and other spaces with trim elements that are clearly Greek Revival and later. So in figuring out, once you've figured out what your house is, the next step is to identify the areas of opportunity for making changes that don't impact the most significant character defining features of the house. And in general, those spaces are going to be secondary spaces, often at the rear of the house or upstairs. They're not going to be the primary rooms at the front of the house. And this illustration just roughly shows where you might put in a larger kitchen and a family room and modern bathrooms and even a deck on this historic Victorian house. But to look more closely at an actual example, we'll go back to Witten House, which spent 60 years as the Topsom Public Library before I bought it. Prior to that, it had been the Witten family home for 2 generations. And when Sarah Witten died at 96 years old in 1941, the house was very much as her parents had rehabbed it or expanded it in the 1850s. It still had no central heating. It still had no modern kitchen. It still had an outhouse. And she lived her whole life from 1845 to 1941 in this completely 19th century house and with no modifications other than the installation of electric lighting in the 1890s. And then the library moved in and made very few changes other than opening up a second floor room to create a meeting room out of 2 bedrooms here and removing the original cooking hearth and fireplace here and adding a modern room when the original woodshed and carriage house were taken down in the 1960s. Otherwise, it was largely intact. So in looking for areas of opportunity here on the right, you see the balloons showing where, starting at the top, where a new bay window might add a lot of light and some additional space to these little tiny rooms in the southwest corner of the house. Room for a bath and laundry room tucked in, a pantry that can be restored to its original character. The cooking hearth and fireplace can be restored to return that original kitchen to its character with a new kitchen in the 1960s edition. And on the second floor, returning the 2 bedroom spaces to a bedroom and a modern master bath and closet, getting a second bath and another secondary room, putting a little fireplace in over the original kitchen, and then returning the 2 attic bedrooms to bedrooms because they had been gutted to strengthen the roof in the 1980s. So these are areas that can be altered to suit life today without impacting any of the historically significant spaces. The spiral stair with its 1850s wallpaper, the front parlor with its 1830s wallpaper, the intact trim throughout the first floor and second floor, none of those things had to be touched in order to add 3 bathrooms and a modern kitchen and restore the primary missing historic feature, which was the original kitchen cooking area. So jumping from the balloons, which move slides here, so that's the same balloon drawing on the left you saw in the previous slide, and then the fully developed plan on the right. You can see the bath and laundry have been tucked in here with a new little hallway. The bay window turns a pretty useless little 8x10 room into a functional little library. The restored historic kitchen features make the dining room now a real centerpiece. And then a modern kitchen gets tucked in here in a modern addition where it has no impact on the historic building. And the same upstairs. The changes stay in these secondary spaces, and the altered master bedroom gets restored to its historic form, and the 2 attic bedrooms get restored. Looking at another type of situation, what do you do when a house has already been altered in a way that is just not in character with its historic form and its historic character? And this example from Portland was rather brilliantly fixed or repaired, or not sure what the exact word is, but very nicely brought into character without losing any of the added space by Nancy Barbet and her team. And here's their design, the existing house on the left with the boxy additions and the cutout in the ground to create a garage. And then the proposed alterations on the right, showing how they just tie it into the house with a few relatively modest changes at the roof level, some changes to the windows and some carriage house doors, and then facing the awful concrete driveway cut with half brick and capping it with granite. And it still is the same house, but it now feels more like it belongs together. It doesn't have all the charm of the original shingle style cottage, but it also doesn't feel like 2 completely different houses that have been slammed together awkwardly in an unhappy marriage. I think this is a brilliant example of how you can pull things together with some relatively modest changes and really achieve a good result. So kitchens and bathrooms, those are, of course, the largest area of change between an 18th or 19th century house and a 21st century house. Witten House did not have a bathroom when built. It had an outhouse out at the end of the shed, and the kitchen was an open fireplace and a brick oven. So introducing these features in a way that allows them to feel related to the historic house is a little bit of a sleight of hand, because you need it to function as a modern kitchen, where most of us are not going to use that gorgeous 1885 Cyrus Carpenter brick set range to cook on. It's lovely to look at, and I've enjoyed many wonderful meals that have come from it, but I can't do that every day. It requires too much time. So how do we function today without the kitchen feeling like an alien intrusion in the house? And so one way to do that is to look to past examples that are historic, if not as old as the house, for inspiration and design clues. So this is an intact bathroom from the early 20th century with fixtures and tile that could be used in a new bathroom today. And similar fixtures are available in reproduction, and salvage companies have original pieces for sale. Subway tile is very popular and available today. So if you have to put in a new bathroom that you want to feel like it fits, even if it's not as old as the house, looking to an earlier historic period than today, but not as old as the house, is a great way to get there. And, elements from different periods. We see here some late 19th century tile and marble at the top, another early 20th century bath at the lower left, and then a mid-20th century bathroom on the right with the hardboard sheet faux tile with aluminum trim. And that material in that period has a wonderful character as well that could be suitable to the right house. So to look at an example project, we're going to look at the modern kitchen for Witten House, where this was the starting point, the 1960s room that had been added to the library as an office with a sink and a single cupboard for the librarians to rinse out their teacups. It functioned in this state as a temporary kitchen for far too long before I actually put in a kitchen. But you see the 1960s paneling, the pressed paperboard tile ceiling, fluorescent lighting, and a concrete floor that had been covered with commercial grade carpeting. And so this was a matter of trying to cover up the 1960s as quickly and as inexpensively as possible, because the goal here is to someday replace this with a larger modern kitchen. The paper tile ceiling was covered with sheetrock, and the paneling grooves were filled and then covered with lining paper and painted to just create a more traditional looking wall surface. And then new solid wood cabinets were purchased with a beadboard design that feels late 19th, early 20th century. These were actually made by a company in New Hampshire, and they're sold through Home Depot. So they're solid wood, New England made, sustainable. A salvaged antique slate sink and drain board counter was used with custom cabinets to fit it. On the right, you see the process of getting it off the floor once the cabinets were attached to it, a slow process of jacking and blocking until it was upright. And then coming together in the room, and then picking details that feel historic, although not 19th century. Or early 19th century like the house, but they evoke the early 20th century or the turn of that century so that they feel compatible. And, the schoolhouse type light fixture, that was $35 from Amazon. You could pay $300 for essentially the same fixture from a high-end repro company, but if you're careful about where you spend your money and put the money into the things that functionally need the higher quality, like the hardware on the doors and drawers that gets used heavily every day, you can get away with spending less on things where there are suitable lesser cost examples available. It doesn't mean going with a design that looks cheap. It means finding a typical compatible design that is produced less expensively. And here we see the completed room. It's a modern kitchen. It's not intended to be historic in any way, but it feels like it belongs with the house. And when you walk from the 1827 kitchen into the 21st century kitchen, there's nothing jarring. It ties together and it feels like it belongs here. And it works for producing meals and cleaning up meals and busy lives in the 21st century. Something to keep in mind whenever restoring or renovating any building is you're going to have to deal with some bureaucrats along the way in almost any jurisdiction. And it may be local historic district ordinances, or it may be building codes and planning boards and zoning. And then there are utility companies, which are sometimes the worst bureaucrats of all. So the keys to getting through those things smoothly are know the vocabulary, understand the review standards for historic districts, understand the process and be prepared so you're not surprised by what you need to do, and provide the documentation that's needed to allow them to get to the answer you want. And pretty much the same with codes and planning boards and zoning. Do your homework. It will make the whole process easier. We can't really talk about life in the 21st century without addressing issues around sustainability and energy efficiency, and the fact that many old houses are reputed, at least, to be terrible in terms of energy efficiency. That's often not true, but it's an area that needs to be addressed in rehabbing a house, and it's often very possible to make a historic house as efficient as a new house. This example is a case study for how far you can go with that. And this was a deep energy retrofit project done as a demonstration project by Freeport Community Services. They took an abandoned mill workers cottage, one of a row of 4, and undertook a project to show just how efficient it could be without losing its historic character. And they went to extremes. They took off the exterior siding and trim and built out the wall with insulation, then reapplied the historic materials. They added, I think, a total of 8 inches of depth to the roof to get maximum insulation at the top. And throughout the house, they went as far as they could go, while carefully adjusting the detailing of the house to make those changes as invisible as possible. And so on the upper right, you see the added depth of the roof is visible in those added new shingles next to the historic shingles. And the other photos show clapboards reinstalled at the new wall thickness and eave details that were carefully worked out so that you didn't see the added height and depth of the building. And in the end, a few interior views to show that the spaces that still had historic character retained it, and spaces that had already been substantially altered were improved. And then the cottage in question is in the foreground, and the other 2 are identical to it, built by the same mill owner at the same time to house his workers. And you can see that this project was done in a way there that you can't really tell that this house can essentially be heated with a light bulb, unlike the other 2 next to it. So it's an example of how far you can go And in many cases, you don't need to go that far to greatly improve what you're dealing with. And often it's about putting in a more efficient heating unit, whether it's a boiler or heat pumps carefully installed in ways that are not very visible, improved insulation, storm windows, rehabbing historic windows to tighten them up. Air sealing is huge and costs very little, but makes an enormous difference in comfort and the cost of staying warm or cool. So there is a lot that can be done to make a historic house functional in efficiency in the 21st century. And that's obviously something we all have to be concerned about at this point in time. And we should be. It's about protecting our planet as well as our personal comfort. And speaking of personal comfort, one of the projects that we did here at Witten House for comfort was to put in radiant heat. And there's the old hot air furnace installed in the 1960s by the library on the left. And there's the new efficient gas boiler that heats the house on the right. With the hot air furnace, prior to insulating the house to any degree, I spent a great deal of money to poorly heat about a third of the house, and I was cold a lot of the time. With the new boiler, the radiant heat and improved insulation and tightening up some windows, the whole house is comfortable and it costs a lot less money. And here's just a shot of the radiant tubing going in under the house. And below this, there was reflective foil and insulation in order to force the heat up. And then for the upper stories, the attic floor came up and the heat went into the ceiling of the second floor with some residual heat moving up to heat those attic bedrooms. So that really has made an enormous difference in the comfort of this house. When you go from a house with floors that are so cold that water will freeze if you spill it when you're watering the plants, to actual heat coming up from your floors, it's pretty remarkable. So now we're going to look at this 1827 kitchen. I talked about that being the missing historic character defining feature of Witten House that was missing, that I chose to put back. And you're seeing the finished result here, but we're going to quickly go through a montage of how it got there. And here you see the starting point, no evidence of the fireplace or the brick oven. They had been removed entirely. There was just a single flue chimney there for a wood stove. And the wall had been removed to open the space into the 1960s addition. All that's historic here are two vertical trim boards and that narrow door at the right. Even the mantle that's behind the bookcase you see is not original. So what was left was the brick arch in the cellar that supported the original chimney mass, which gave us its dimensions. And then evidence, once we had stripped away the sheetrock to see the original lath of where the wall configurations were and the original size of the fireplace opening. And with that information, it was possible to actually accurately recreate what had been there in terms of masonry. And Richard Irons, the master, reconstructed the beehive brick oven, which works really well. And here we are with the masonry part of the job largely completed, and the added fireplace upstairs, which is a 19th century cast iron insert that was rescued from behind the barn next door. And there's a photo of it in the house next door in the 19th century. And the masonry chimney building in Maine in winter. It can be done. And then finding the original mantle profile in the buildup of paint layers on those surviving original vertical boards, and then reproducing it and just using the evidence that was found to accurately recreate what had been there, and in a way that I can confidently say would be recognized by Myra Witten if she walked into her kitchen today. And then dealing with plaster issues on the ceiling and walls, replastering the ceiling, repairing walls, and so on, to restore the room to its appearance in 1827 as a functional kitchen of that era. And we do hearth cooking periodically. And as if you look at the background of my photo at this moment, you can see I'm sitting in this room, and picture from hearth cooking. Another view of the completed room, looking very much as it did in 1827. So I'm going to wrap up by giving you a plug for my book. Most of the images and information that I've covered come from the first couple of chapters of the book, which deal with finding the right historic house, identifying what it is, and then planning your project. And the wonderful photos that you've seen are by Dave Clough. And Dave traveled from Maine to New Mexico to photograph the 13 featured houses that are presented between the how-to chapters of the book. And here he is working at Dow Farm when we were doing that shoot. And this is how the featured houses are presented, with an essay about their history and their restoration. There's a before photo of Hench House on the lower right. And then photos, both Dave's current photos and photos showing the restoration process for each of the houses. Part one is project planning, which is largely what we've been talking about today. I skipped part two. Systems, which we also touched on today. The exterior envelope is part 4. Interior finishes are part 5. We touched a little bit on that with the 1827 kitchen project. A quote I'm very proud of from Patricia Poore, editor of Old House Journal. She gets me, I think. The goal with the book was to explain the why to along with the how to. Lots of reviews on Amazon if you want to go take a look. And if you'd like to purchase signed or personalized copies directly from me, go to yourhistorichouse.com. I also have, as I mentioned at the beginning, Facebook and Instagram accounts for Restoring Your Historic House. Join 50,000 people who are following me for daily posts on historic houses. And with that, we'll go to the Q&A, and Allie will lead and I'll try to answer.
All right, terrific. And we do have a couple questions. The first you actually just alluded to the answer to in your description of your work with Dave Clough and doing the photography. One of our attendees asked whether the featured houses were all in Maine, with the exception of the Chicago bungalow. And the answer
no, the majority are in Maine, but they range from Maine to Santa Fe.
Great. Our next question is from Claudia. Was there a cellar in the Witten house? And I think the answer to that is yes, because
there is a low, wet, clay-lined cellar under the kitchen L only. The main block of the house just has a crawl space, which when I bought the house, in some areas had soil within 6 inches of the wood framing. Not ideal. dirt had been moved around when they put in the big ductwork for the forced hot air heating system in the 1960s, and it was not in great shape. The library had 20,000 books in the house, which
Ooh.
created weight issues, and so periodically they'd send someone under the house with a bunch of pine blocks to stack up. And so I excavated 18 cubic yards of dirt out of there by hand to create a clear 28-inch tall area, which provided the access to put in the radiant heat and the new insulation.
Cool, excellent. The next one you might not have a picture for, but you could probably describe possibly. Claudia asks about examples of heat pump installations that are inconspicuous and air conditioning. Can you describe a little bit about?
Yeah,
About that?
there are a couple approaches to this. Important things are to run any tubing inside walls or inside closets or in attic or basement areas. Do not run your tubing up the exterior wall and slap a plastic cover over it. It's not going to work. It's not going to look good. And the same for placement of compressors, inconspicuous locations. If necessary, do some screening with fencing or shrubbery, but try to keep it as out of sight as possible. And then in placing the units within the house, obviously they're not in character with a historic interior. Unfortunately, no one has yet really seemed to take on coming up with a design that is not an obvious piece of plastic mounted on the wall. So try to place them, for instance, over the entry door to a room. So the heat blows into the room, and as you and your guests walk into the room, you're not looking at that in front of you. It's above and behind you, and hopefully you're going to be focused on a fireplace or a television or something else that's looking away. So think about, the view lines and how people will use the room to place these things where they have as little visible presence as possible. And then the other approach is to go with one of the high velocity, small duct central air systems, which can be used for hot and air conditioning. And they just have, little round outlets that can be in the ceiling or the floor, and small tubes that run in walls and ceilings. So they're not requiring the giant duct work of traditional central air conditioning, which can be hard to hide in a historic house as well.
Well, those are great tips. The high velocity system that you just described, I'm familiar with that. As efficient as old school, better, in addition to being low profile?
According to the major manufacturer of those, which is the Unico system, they are as efficient or more efficient than traditional central air conditioning systems.
Well, thank you. Our next question is from Anne, and Anne, I can actually answer this, but I'll let Scott talk about it in a little more detail. The Dow farmhouse is in Standish.
Yes.
Any other comments you want to share about Dow? I've been out there myself. It's spectacular.
Yeah, the Dow farm is in Standish. It has been in the same family since around the first decade of the 19th century. It was built by another family in the 18th century, but the Dow family has been there now for many generations. And it's a wonderful story of a family that moved away after the last generation that farmed the land passed on, and later generations lived out of state but used it as a summer place. And over time, it was used less and was becoming neglected. And in the mid-1970s, a young man named Don Essman, who had an interest in historic preservation, was looking for a place to live and noticed one of the siblings who owned it was there from out of state, and stopped and introduced himself and said, "Would you like a caretaker for this place? It needs some help." And the long and the short of it is that Donald moved in and started doing work on the house. And over the now more than 45 years he's been there, he's completely restored it.
Yeah. And the work
And
continues.
the family has largely provided the funding for materials, and Donald has done the labor.
Yeah.
And as of this week, he's replacing a piece of sill on the back of the main house.
Right. And if folks are interested in seeing some more images of that house before they buy Scott's book, the Dow farmhouse and its owners were recipients of an honor award in 2018 from our organization. And so there's a host of images on our site that you could take a look at. And we'll send that link around, I think, along with the materials from today's session to give you
Great.
a quick click to that information. Our next question is from Stephen. Was the second floor of your house added on top of the cape as opposed to the cape being raised up and a new floor added underneath?
Yes, in this case, they took the roof off and added the new second story and roof above the original house. Within a mile of this house, there are at least 3 examples where they jacked the original house up and built a new first story under it. But in the case of this house and the one next door, they did put a new second story and roof over the original cape.
Great. Dan asking, your first house picture, so this is taking us back, the 1769 house had 9/6 windows. Can this window style be used to indicate the age of the house?
As a rule, 9/6 windows appear in earlier houses. I would say primarily before 1850. Depending on where you are, that date can move somewhat. But smaller glass panes were more available early on. As the 19th century advanced, glass became less expensive, bigger panes became more available. And so 6/6 became the norm by the middle of the 19th century. And then you get to the end of the century with the shingle style and the colonial revival, and they start wanting to evoke the character of the earlier period. And so you see 9/6 or 12/1, or, all these odd but multi-paned windows sort of come back after a century of evolving toward 2/2 or 2/1. So as a rule, 9/6 will indicate a house before 1850.
Okay. And our next question is from John. How do you feel about older drywall installed in a 19th century house? Should it be replaced or can it be used by replastering?
Drywall is an inferior material to traditional plaster. It does not have the same visual qualities. Even when well installed, if you look carefully, you're going to find that seam every 4 feet. It's just the nature of the machine-made material is that it's dead flat. And to hide the seams, you have to have an area that isn't dead flat. And suddenly, if you look, you can see it. It doesn't have the sound deadening qualities of traditional plaster and so on. If you've got a situation where it's already there and you don't have an unlimited budget, which few of us have an unlimited budget, doing skim coat plaster over it is a way to get that more handcrafted character back into the space. Without going to the expense of ripping it out and putting in traditional lath and plaster. In the spaces that were missing plaster in Witten House, or where I've put a wall back that was missing, I have gone with blue board and skim coat plaster as a reasonable balance for maintaining the character in a way that allows the budget to cover some other things as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, our next question is also, I would say, budget related. So porches can be very brittle, especially when they're original to 1833. Would composite versus wood be okay for this? Asks our questioner, Dean. Also, we have 1833 windows that are crumbling. When is a replacement that looks the same okay?
Oh, two loaded questions.
Yeah, right. We have whole sessions on windows, Gene. You've probably been to them.
The book has whole sections on windows and substitute materials, and including a chart for kind of analyzing when a substitute material might be appropriate. Because there are situations where I think substitute materials may be appropriate. And in particular, an area that you know is always going to be wet. And that wood will, even good quality wood, will not last. And as most of you may know, good quality wood is very hard to find today. So most of what's out there is crap that's not going to last long at all. So there can be situations where substitute materials are appropriate or can be considered appropriate. Areas that you know are not going to get good maintenance, like on a cupola or the side of a house that overhangs a cliff, that you're just not going to get to it to maintain it properly, to have it survive as wood. Then a substitute material that looks like wood, might be appropriate in those instances. The unknown with these materials is what they're going to do in 50 years or 100 years. They're new. No one knows. There's also the fact that they are petroleum products that have just an awful environmental cost in their creation. So you have to balance out all of these things and determine where it makes sense and if it can be done in a way that really doesn't look any different than it would if it were done in the traditional material. Going to windows, a good window restorer can save almost any historic window. When you get to the point where a window really is beyond reasonable rehabilitation, then if you're looking for a replacement, it's essential that you match the historic window as closely as possible in its dimensions, its details, its profiles, its materials. You know, a vinyl window is never an appropriate substitute for a wood window. And in many cases, a standard wood replacement window isn't going to match as well as it should to the historic window. So if you're going with replacements, you really need to do a lot of work to make sure you get the right replacement. And then make sure it's being made either from old growth wood, redwood, mahogany, something that's going to last, or you're going to be replacing the replacement window in 20 or 25 years.
Great. Thank you. And Jean just let us know that she just bought your book. So,
oh, thank you, Jean.
She's got window concerns. And good luck with them, Jean. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask out loud? You could unmute yourself at this point, and because we could take a question or two more. Folks, have any questions? Scott, why don't you hop to the next slide while folks consider whether they have a question, and I'll tell everyone about what's coming up. So on the 28th, we're going to have a session on in our rehab lab on tips for fall maintenance, so things you can do to get your house ready for winter, and a mini session on DIY interior storm windows. Pretty excited about this. Topher Belknap from Midcoast Green Collaborative, Laura Seaton from Window Dressers, and Jonathan Hall from Maine Preservation are going to talk about how you can put together some storm windows for the inside of your house to keep you cozier this winter. And then in November, this date is wrong, I apologize. On November 11th, we are going to have Matt Collins and Ellen Angel of Artifacts come and talk to us about historic structure reports. This one is a niche topic, but an important one. It's an important preservation planning tool, and they're going to walk us through the whys and hows and how they put those reports together. And that's going to be an interesting session on the professional side. Anybody have any questions?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes. Hello.
Okay. Well, when you talk about understanding your historic building, I am looking at my cellar. I live in a house that the original cape, it's a connected farmstead, but the original cape was built in 1820. And so there's a dirt floor and stone and brick walls, and they let quite a bit of moisture in. And I'm just trying to figure out what would be the best way of insulating the cellar, keeping the moisture from going up into the house. I love the idea of the radiant floors. That seems like that might solve a really big problem. But I've had everything from people suggest putting spray foam insulation over the whole thing and creating an envelope, which I'm just saying, no, forget it. I'm not, that just seems like it's, completely opposite from the way the house was originally designed, because it was originally a root cellar. So I'm just wondering what you can tell me briefly.
Yeah, and water under houses is a serious issue. I say several times in the book and regularly in my life that water is the enemy. It particularly for wooden structures. It's no friend of masonry structures either if it's not well managed. So as a starting point, look at what you can do to keep the water that falls on the house from ending up under the house. And that's with guttering or grading or French drains or whatever of the available approaches would suit your circumstances to make sure that water that falls on the house ends up away from the house, not under it. And once that's controlled, if you still have moisture problems under the house, you may have a spring nearby. You could have just groundwater that flows on a layer of marine clay till it hits your rock foundation, which creates a little pool for it. That's the situation in my cellar. So if you can't completely stop the water without going to extraordinary efforts to seal it from the exterior, then it's about controlling what happens to the water when it gets inside. And that often involves a perimeter drain going to a sump pit and a sump pump to take the water out, and then a moisture barrier over the dirt floor to prevent moisture from just migrating up through the dirt. So that largely would control the water that comes in and remove it without it becoming vapor that moves up into your framing and your living space. If you were to pursue putting in radiant and sealing that floor with insulation, that does create an effective vapor barrier at that level and prevents it from getting into your framing or your living space. But you still want to address it coming in below there so you don't end up with a pool of water under your nice dry house, which is bad for your foundation. So managing the water is the key. And then once you've done everything you reasonably can do, as a last step, you might need to run a dehumidifier down there if it really is an extreme situation. But keeping that area dry is really important to the overall health of your house, both for the house and for yourself.
Great, thanks. Any other questions? We have time for maybe one or two more.
I had one. This is Claudia. Hi, Scott.
Hi, Claudia.
First of all, I want to say I bought 2 of his books because they're so wonderful.
Aw,
I have one in Maine and I have one in my home in Washington, D.C. So I can show everybody what a great book it is. But my question was about the radiant floor heat. Now, I have a neighbor who says, oh, it's such a bad idea because when you have wide floorboards, they're going to, shrink and expand. And I don't know. So what do I think we're decided we're going to do it, but, is that an issue ever?
Well, as someone who lives with wide floorboards that shrink and expand, I can tell you that the difference between their seasonal shrinking and expanding before radiant heat and after radiant heat is not noticeable. They've always expanded and contracted seasonally. They still do. The difference is now they're comfortable in the winter. And a couple of things that can be done to minimize any possible effect from putting that much heat directly under these boards is to put in enough tubing so that you can run at a somewhat lower temperature. So you're, instead of, X number of feet of tubing at X number of degrees of heat to keep the living space at a given temperature, if you put in more tubing, you can run it at a lower temperature, which puts less heat directly against the subfloor and then the finished floor. But in my experience, the difference between radiant and not radiant with wide board floors is pretty minimal.
Thank you.
thank you.
Scott, this is George from Fisher House.
Hi, George.
Hey, I just wanted to say congratulations. A very good presentation. Quite
Thank
well
you.
done.
Thank you,
And the
George.
book is pretty astounding, quite frankly.
Oh, and thank you for the blurb for the back cover.
You did have some other kudos on the chat, Scott, if you want to take a
Thank
scroll.
you, George.
People are really happy.
You're welcome.
Thanks, George. Any other questions? So Scott, if you want to hop to the next slide for me.
Sure.
Greg, you want to say a few words before we break?
Well, I really want to thank Scott for that excellent presentation. Really appreciate it. And I don't know that any of you saw him at Brickyard Hollow, where he did a presentation for us in person. We thought, what an opportunity with Zoom to reach a broader audience with people getting there a little easier than some of you can arrive from, say, North Carolina to Yarmouth, Maine. And actually, we've really enjoyed the ability to get to people throughout the state in this. And, it's great to hear the techniques for rehabilitation. There's a lot of myths out there about how expensive it is. And often that means because people are removing so much material, they have to replace it. So doing it the right way, and with all the historic tax credit projects we've seen where the amount of expenditure is documented publicly, we really see that rehabilitation is a very reasonable way to take care of a building, historic rehabilitation done well. And the other element that relates to that Scott was raising is, how long are the new materials that you're going to replace your old materials with going to last? And we have materials in our historic buildings many times that are 100, 200 years old. They're very durable, they're very dense, they're very long lasting. So a lot of times it's tempting to look at the latest new product, but as Scott said, that product may last 10 years. And we're finding, we're hearing from a lot of new window owners that after 10 years, those elements of the windows start to delaminate, the argon seeps out of the double glazing, et cetera, et cetera. And they've replaced a 100-year-old window or a 200-year-old window. And what they're really in for, unfortunately, is replacement constantly then over a much, much shorter period of time. So thank you, Scott, for bringing all this to our attention. We hope that you in the audience will help continue to support us. We, like everyone else, are facing challenges in this economy. But we're hanging in there so far, but we really need the help of those of you who are committed to this field. So thank you for your interest in coming today and hearing this excellent presentation.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Scott, so much. This was wonderful.
Thank you. And thanks to Maine Preservation for all the work you guys do.
Thanks,
Cheers.
Scott.
Bye, everybody. Have a great afternoon.